Good morning. We are here with the legendary Sonia Fuentes, author, feminist, and activist who's been involved for much of the 20th century and well into now the 21st century. I'm so grateful to have her with us.
Hi, Kate. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thanks, Sonia. I'd like to first start out with this question. You are one of the probably very few, if not only few, women today who actually touched history, who actually had an experience and met the legendary Alice Paul, hallmark in the early suffragist movement. Can you tell us a little bit about what she did and then your experience with her?
Well, Alice Paul was a founder of the National Woman's Party, which exists to this day and has its headquarters on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. She has been described as one of the most charismatic figures to come out of the suffrage movement. I knew her because I served on the Board of Trustees for the National Woman's Party for many years, and also had occasion to visit her a few years before her death when she was in a nursing home in Ridgefield, Connecticut. She was one of a million with regard to devoting her life to securing suffrage.
She also had an extraordinary background in education, getting her PhD at a time when women were barely allowed to speak. What makes her, when you say the word charismatic, and we read that all the time, but what does that really mean for us today?
Well, in her case, as I said, I think the outstanding thing is that she devoted her life to securing suffrage, and when it was secured, she then drafted the ERA with someone else and spent the rest of her life working for that. She also spent time in Geneva, where she founded the World Women's Party, working with the League of Nations, also to secure women's rights.
Now, going back to that original suffragist movement, who inspires you or inspired you, one of the women?
All of the suffragists inspire me. What they went through so that we today could vote is just incredible to me. I have spent 55 years of my life fighting for women's rights, but I never exposed myself to any physical discomfort or danger. These women picketed the White House. They were called silent sentinels. They were arrested and put in the District of Columbia jail and the Occoquan workhouse in Virginia. There was one night there when it was called the Night of Terror, when the order was given to terrorize these women, and they were beaten with clubs, and one of them had a heart attack, and they were force-fed when they went on a hunger strike. And the conditions at the two places where they were kept, the DC jail and the Occoquan workhouse, were horrendous. Their food was filled with worms, their open toilets, it was just horrendous. And these were women of quality. And to me, especially the force feeding was horrendous when they announced that they were going to starve or fast. They were force fed. Alice Paul was force fed not only in the United States, but she had also gone to England and worked with the leading suffragists there. The Pankhurst mother, Emmeline Pankhurst, and her daughters, Sylvia and Christabel, she was force-fed in England in Holloway Prison in London. So all of these women are inspiring to me. A leading one was, I'm thinking of her name.
Inez?
Inez, help me out.
Milholland. Yeah.
Inez Milholland. She gave her life for suffrage. She was a woman who was 30 years old at the time that she died. She was married. She was a lawyer. She was well known for going at the front of suffrage parades on a white horse. And on one occasion, she became ill, and she was scheduled to give a speech and was told not to because she was ill. And she went anyway, gave the speech for suffrage, and died shortly thereafter. Gave her life for suffrage.
That is an incredible sacrifice. And here today, we take it almost for granted, oh, we can go out and vote. But to realize that people gave their lives for that vote and their health with the forced feedings, that's remarkable.
It's mind-blowing to me, and I've known it for many, many years, and I still can't get over it. When I read the details of the forced feeding, it was just something horrendous. And Alice Paul, at one time, they put her in the psychiatric ward of the DC jail, and she couldn't sleep at night because they would shine a light on her face periodically so that she could not sleep.
I know, and today we say psychiatric ward, but today it has a very different connotation. It means you get help and safety and security. Then that was dangerous. There was something wrong with you, and they had permission in those places to do terrible things to people.
Well, in Alice Paul's case, they were punishing her.
Right, right. You're talking about the silent sentinels, and there is Woodrow Wilson in the White House, and very early he was against the suffrage movement. What do you know about that?
Well, the women, Alice Paul and other women, kept meeting with him and asking him for his support, which he did not give. But Alice Paul learned a technique when she worked with the Pankhursts in England, and that was that when it comes to anybody in political office, no matter what his position on anything, if he is not a supporter of suffrage, we will fight against him. So that Alice Paul came back with that philosophy that she learned in England, and from then on, she and all her co-workers knew that when there was any politician involved, if he didn't support suffrage, they would work against him. So they worked against Wilson. What finally caused him to change his mind, other than their persistence, I don't know, but he eventually changed his mind.
That is the great mystery of the 20th century, I think. What was that genesis?
My guess would be that he saw they weren't going away. They kept going, and eventually that's why he did it, I would think.
Mm-hmm. We wonder what his wife thought and how
we don't know that.
She may have played in.
I don't know that.
Yeah, and that's the big silence of women for so many years, is that muteness that we don't know their voice.
Well, she was a president's wife. She couldn't very well speak out if she opposed what he was doing.
It wasn't until Eleanor Roosevelt that the president's wife began to really find voice, too.
And that was partially because he was disabled.
Speaking about genesis, I'd like to move forward now to this century, this past century, the 20th century. And the genesis of you. You were born at a time when women's roles were very constricted and their expectations were constricted. You came from an immigrant family. What was the spark for you? What was your personal genesis or awakening?
Well, it started with the fact that I was born a Jew in Berlin, Germany in 1928. And in 1933, Hitler came to power. And my parents and brother and I had to flee. So at a very early age, I saw what discrimination for an invidious reason did to people. So I, at an early age, was aware of anti-Semitism and what it did. We were fortunate. We went first to Antwerp, Belgium, couldn't get permission to remain there, and then came to the United States in 1934. I grew up in the Catskill Mountains of New York, and I had allergies to certain things, And the doctor told my parents to take me to Florida and that maybe I'd do better there. So we began driving to Florida every winter, and we would drive through the South, and I would see the segregated restrooms, the segregated benches, the segregated water fountains, the racist headlines in the newspaper, and all that affected me very deeply. And when I grew up, I became a life member of the NAACP. So I was now interested in discrimination against Jews and against blacks. But I never gave thought to the second-class status of women in this country. It was such a given that I just accepted it as that's the way life was. And never thought about it until I became a lawyer and joined the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission 3 months after they opened. They opened on July 2nd, 1965, and I joined it on October 4th, 1965. I was the first woman lawyer in its Office of the General Counsel. And that's when I became sensitized to women's rights, because that agency had the task of implementing and administering Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that statute prohibits, it's now broader than that, but when I was there at the beginning, it prohibited discrimination by employers, employment agencies, and labor unions based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. So for about the first year, a year and a half, that commission wasn't really interpreting that portion of the law dealing with gender discrimination. And I was right there, and I saw that, and it hit my sense of justice, and that's the time that I became a feminist.
It's almost as if these very visible prejudices with the Jews, with the African Americans were very visible, but the invisible prejudice against women, they prepared you, and then the time was right for you to see it. As you say, it was ubiquitous everywhere. It was ingrained, so hardwired into our culture. And that awakening happened in a long preparation, really, of justice.
Just this morning, I read something that came to me on the computer, which blew my mind. I didn't realize that there had to be a special law that was passed and signed in 1879 to allow women to argue before the United States Supreme Court. Before that, women weren't allowed to argue before the Supreme Court, and the same was true in many states. And I read one justice in a state court saying it is the role of men to protect women, and it is the role of women to be wives and mothers, and they're not suited to do anything else. And that is the law of the Creator, said this judge. And I read that and I thought, oh my God, what the women had to put up with in those days.
Absolutely.
I'd like to end today with a question for you. Where do we need to go from here?
Well, when I give talks, I end them with a list of 20 things that need to be done in the United States for women, and then another smaller list which includes those and adds on things that need to be done in other countries. It is a huge list, and I brought it with me today in case I need to look at it, but we just need to keep doing what we've been doing and hitting it every time we find a case of discrimination. It goes on all the time. For example, some time ago I read that if a man and a woman, scholars, author a research paper, everyone refers to that paper only by the man's name. Now that's a smaller thing, but it just shows how insidious this kind of thing is. So just about every field you mentioned, still there are many things to be done.
It's still so ingrained in us, isn't it?
Yeah, because it's not as time goes. If I was alive before we had any changes in women's rights. You can see that this is a fairly recent development. And what we've accomplished is mind-blowing to me. When we started NOW, the National Organization for Women, we didn't have such grandiose ideas. We didn't expect to revolutionize this country and the world, as has been happening. So we've created a revolution, but there's much more to be done, and many young women and men who will do it.
And if there's one thing you would say, if you could talk to them right now, the young men and women who are joining that struggle still, what would you say?
Continue the fight. We have to continue the fight.
Thank you, Sonia.
I have made a list that I use when I give speeches on women's rights of the problems that remain, and I've numbered them, and I can just mention them briefly. Number 1, poverty, hunger, and homelessness. Poverty is a women's issue. Nearly 6 in 10 poor adults are women. More than 1 in 5 children is at risk of hunger. Poverty rates are especially high for single mothers, women of color, and elderly women living alone. 2, the continuing wage and salary gap. We've made progress in decreasing the salary gap between men and women, but it still exists. 3, violence against women, and this covers a host of areas: sex crimes, rape, sexual assault, non-consensual sexual contact, and so on. Sexual assault on campus is rampant, and that's part of the sexual assault problem. And colleges and universities have failed to respond adequately. Sexual assault in the military is a problem. The Department of Defense has estimated that there were 19,000 sexual assaults against women and men in the military during fiscal year 2014. Domestic violence is a huge problem. Women's reproductive rights and continuing efforts to whittle down Roe versus Wade. This is one of the most controversial and difficult problems in our country. Abortion is a common experience. At current rates, about 1 in 3 American women will have had an abortion by the time she reaches the age of 45. But most of our political leaders on the federal and state level are fighting to make abortion difficult, if not impossible, for women. Five, employer accommodations for pregnancy-related work limitations. This is an area where people are working. 6, this is a shocking area, inadequate maternal health care. The United States has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world among developed nations. It's unbelievable. And black women are particularly prone to maternal mortality. 7, the absence of laws mandating paid parental and sick leave. 8, the lack of affordable and competent child care. I have a daughter, and I gave birth to her in 1972, and the biggest problem I had in raising her was finding competent and affordable child care, and that problem has only gotten worse since then. 8, have I missed 8? That was 8. 9, women in prison. In federal correctional facilities, 70% of the guards are male, and correctional officials have subjected female inmates to rape, other sexual assaults, sexual extortion, and groping during body searches. In some states still, women are chained when they're in labor. Florida and other states have laws against this, but not all of them are being complied with. 11, girls and women with disabilities. They have particular problems and they're not being adequately dealt with. 12, inadequate access to health care. 13, the inadequate representation of women in science, technology, engineering, and math, the so-called STEM jobs, and among STEM degree holders. 14, the inadequate representation of women in political life. We have fortunately had an African American president, but not yet a woman president. 15, discrimination in academia. At a congressional hearing in 1970, an academic woman said the rule where women are concerned is simply this: the higher, the fewer. In other words, the higher in terms of level of education, the higher in terms of faculty rank, the higher in terms of responsibility, the fewer are women, and that remains true today. 16, underrepresentation in the justice system. The image of justice as a blindfolded woman balancing scales is ingrained in our culture, but women throughout the justice system, as judges, prosecutors, and police officers, remain underrepresented. 17, inadequate representation among those who run our top corporations and serve on corporate boards. 18, inadequate representation and unequal pay for actors, writers, directors, and producers in the entertainment industry. 19, surrogacy, also known as third-party reproduction. Surrogacy is a wonderful thing for people who want to have a child, but it exposes women who are egg donors and surrogates to very difficult physical problems and sometimes death. And the laws in this area have been called the Wild West of the legal system. They are all over the lot, and they do not adequately protect women. The failure to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, and the failure to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. That's a treaty called CEDAW. Internationally, there are additional problems. High rates of preventable maternal, newborn, child, and adolescent mortality. So-called honor killings. Female genital mutilation. Forced and child marriages, and the abduction and rape of girls into renegade guerrilla forces. Poisonings and acid attacks and shootings of schoolgirls, and rape used as an instrument of war. So when you ask me what's left to be done, those are some of the things.
Say that last time. You asked me.
So when you ask me what remains to be done, those are just some of the things. Keep up the fight.